the WTA sign, which indicated as a tagline, quote, a hub for connecting commuters, quote. And as I think as Jenny very comprehensively outlined in her remarks, the mission of the WTA is to, quote, to work directly with employers and employees to enhance economic opportunity, improve health, and foster a livable community via transportation options, unquote. So, you know, both this tagline and the mission statement are focused on people, but the goals implied are broad, overarching, and have a very strong systemic nature to them. So in other words, there are more factors involved than just the people themselves. So most of you are familiar with the Washington County Transportation Future Study Project, which is currently going on. And this is looking decades out into the future to anticipate and plan for the transportation needs of the county, given a host of economic, environmental, and human factors. So traditionally, when we have these discussions around transportation, we sort of end up with this dimension where we have sort of the people and the human needs on one side, and we have commercial interests, aka freight interests, on the other side. And this dichotomy ends up playing out in our discussions, in our arguments, and in our politics. Well, you know, this dimension is probably a rather false dimension and a false dichotomy. And especially given the WTA interest, what we want to do today is think of not so much people versus freight and the commercial interests, but people and freight and commercial interests. Because I think we believe that basically the entire transportation system benefits when all of these interests are taken into account and when all of these interests are in fact served. So today, the WTA is putting together, I think, what's going to be an extraordinarily interesting and provocative panel facilitated by Bernie Bottomley. And so I'm going to introduce Bernie, and then Bernie, I think, in turn, will introduce the rest of our very esteemed panel. So many of you, I think, are familiar with Bernie Bottomley, who is a native of Beaverton and is currently TriMet's Executive Director of Public Affairs. His current portfolio includes government affairs, communications, customer service, planning, and policy areas. Bernie has served in an earlier and separate stint with TriMet between 1993 and 2002, when he was the agency's legislative director in Salem. And then Bernie has also served on the staff of U.S. Congressman Les Coyne as a community affairs director at Pacific Power and as vice president of government affairs and economic development for the Portland Business Alliance. So he's very well situated to help moderate this panel. So let's welcome Bernie.
Thank you, Phil. Welcome, everybody. I hope you will feel free to grab some additional food or drink as we go along. Don't stand on ceremony. Fear not. So thank you for that introduction, Phil. And I'll introduce the rest of our panel. I did grow up in Beaverton. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Vos School. Vos School. Those of you who are familiar with it know it's a round school, and when I went there in the 1960s, it was known as the Round School for Square Kids. So that's my claim to fame in Beaverton. So I'm going to introduce our panel. Susie Lahsene is in the middle here, is Director of Public Policy or Policy and Planning at the Port of Portland. There's a lot of P's in her title. She manages land use, policy, and transportation strategy for the port's transportation facilities and industrial lands. She chairs Oregon's statewide Freight Advisory Committee, which is known as OFAC, and was past chair of the Transportation Research Board Urban Freight Committee, which is the national sort of policy development, technical development program. She's originally from Washington, D.C. She moved to Oregon after graduate school. She holds a BA degree in urban studies and a master's degree in urban and regional planning, both from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University in Blacksburg, Virginia. She holds an MBA from the University of Portland. Welcome, Susie. Pam Treece is the Executive Director of the Westside Economic Alliance. She's been a key player in regional economic development activities for many years. Prior to joining WEA, she served as a consultant to the Greater Portland Inc. Program, which is our regional economic development entity, and is the former director of Association of Regional Partners, which is also an economic development group. She served as Vice President of Oregon External Affairs at Pacific Corp, where we worked together. And she taught me everything I needed to know about the energy business. Pam's a native Oregonian. She received her undergraduate degree from Portland State University and her master's degree from Lewis and Clark College. So welcome, Pam. Matthew Arnold is an associate principal and director of urban design and planning at SERA Architects. Since joining SERA in 2003, Matt has concentrated on downtown planning, streetscape design, placemaking, and bike and pedestrian planning. Recently, he's worked on campus planning and retrofitting of suburban office parks, activities with which he is engaged both here in Oregon and in Silicon Valley. Matt is the former chair of the City of Portland's Bicycle Advisory Committee, and, for better or worse, is a Boston Red Sox fan. I'll just point out that they're, second in the AL East now?
First in the AL East.
Or first in the AL East. And it's also the reason why SERA Architects never gets any business in New York. So the goal, and actually Phil did a tremendous job, and Pam and I were just saying, maybe we just yield the time to Phil and he can just keep going, because he did a great job of outlining the issue that we're trying to grapple with here tonight. So what I want to do is, how many of you are familiar with the SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities? So I thought we'd frame this discussion a little bit in terms of a SWOT analysis. We may not have time for the threats part because we want to get to your question. So it's maybe more of a SWO analysis as a framework for this discussion. And so we'll kind of go through what are the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities around the Portland metro area and Washington County transportation system as it comes to the idea of balancing people movement and freight movement. And then what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what this association can do to try to advance the idea of reaching that balance in a way that you'd like to see it. So what are the activities that the organization can undertake to help advocate for that outcome that we want to see? So before I do that, I just want to get a sense of the audience in your travel mode. So how many here drive on a regular basis, drive their vehicle to work? How many ride their bicycle to work? Scout, you can raise your hand. Ride their bike to work on a regular basis. Okay, how many of you typically drive an 80,000-pound Freightliner Roadmaster long-haul truck? Just hands? No hands. I did learn just earlier that your executive director, Jenny, once did drive a bus as for a living, so it's not as unusual as you see. So nobody here drives an 80,000-pound truck with a turning radius of 65 feet and a width of 12.5 feet. Well, that's not including the mirrors, so 13.5, 14 feet wide. So what I thought I'd do first is ask Susie Lahsene, who's been engaged in a number of projects to analyze the freight system in the Portland region over the last decade or so, to maybe just recap for us the findings of the regional freight congestion study and the Westside freight analysis that were both done, just so you have a little sense of the freight component of the transportation system, because I think all of us live the people movement part of it on a regular basis, but not necessarily the freight movement. So let's start with that.
Okay, and Bernie, if you don't mind, what I want to do is sort of set the stage a little bit and talk about freight typologies, just so we all sort of have a visual in our heads. So freight is goods movement carried by a variety of modes. Truck is one, but also could be ship, could be rail, could be air. And it's basically, those goods are moving from a point of one level of value to a point of higher value. So if you just think about anything that's moving, it's usually going somewhere to result in a higher value at some point. When we think about goods, at least the way we've talked about it at the national level, is there's the urban goods movement, which is really kind of your local pickup and delivery, everything that a city absolutely needs to have, and that typically comes by truck. Or in some cases, if you're Portland roasting, it comes by bike. Then there is also those things made in Oregon, and those things made in Oregon typically are going somewhere else, either domestically or globally. And when they move, they will often move by truck or rail, and if they're going globally, then they move by truck air or truck marine, waterways. And then the third typology, the third sort of category, is things made elsewhere and that are basically coming into Oregon. And they're coming into Oregon to be an input into a process, to be a raw material, to turn into something else, or to be an end product that we are all looking for or going to be using. And again, that's global and domestic, and so if it moves globally, sometimes it can be air freight, but typically it's rail or truck. And if it's moving internationally or globally, then it's air and marine. And I think that's kind of important because when you're thinking about how things are moving, that sort of the market that they're going to becomes critical, because that's the type of mode that they're going to move by. And what dictates that? It's basically economics. It's time, cost, and value of the product, and to some degree weight. So for example, high value products like chips, not potato chips, are time certain, and they are low weight, and so they typically go by air freight at some point in their trip. So marine products are international in nature, but are not so time dependent, right? It takes a long time to go across that ocean. Rail is typically domestic, and it's heavy and less time dependent. And then truck. Truck is actually the workhorse of the freight system. About 75 to 77% of all freight trips go by truck. And so that's kind of sort of the outline of the way the freight system operates, if you will. So I'm going to give you some specific examples. I'm going to use some bikes or bike parts as a way of thinking about this. So according to my son, who builds bikes and is a very very cogent bicyclist, he says Taiwan is the hotbed for anything bikes. So if you're getting products from Taiwan, it's typically coming, right, air freight potentially, depending upon the type of product, or it could be coming in a container, which means it comes into some gateway on the West Coast most likely, and then it gets trucked to either you as an individual or to the retail location. And that, you can follow that line of thinking with Shimano gears, with Chris King. Chris King is located here, so most of their products move by actual truck, or Thompson components, depending upon what part of the bike you're talking about. And I only think that it's worthwhile to mention that because it really does begin to tell the story of what type of truck is on what route and why they're there. And that helps us think about, okay, how do we need to design the system to address what their needs are? Because ultimately, as Bernie was saying, what we know from businesses is that, this is not surprising, time is money. Transportation and logistics for a product represents between 5 and 15% of that product cost at the end of the day. So if they are able to manage that cost and ensure efficiency of the system, that translates into a direct benefit in terms of cost reduction. When we looked at the Westside freight and logistics analysis, we looked specifically at compute and electronics needs and those particular business industries. FEI was one of them, Intel was another. And let me just give you a summary of some of the things that they described as issues. One is that they were really looking at what was the fastest routing for their product ultimately to get to a consolidation center at the airport. They were concerned about the carrier equipment type and availability. Was there the right type of equipment that they were going to need to be able to move their product? What was the qualification of the carrier? And then ultimately, what's the cost? We also discovered that while the particular industry thinks that they are moving a product a certain way, they actually turn over that responsibility to a third-party logistics company. And that third-party logistics company makes the decision about where ultimately that product is leaving the United States, what gateway it's leaving from. The trucking company that the third-party logistics company hires is the one that makes the route decisions. So you can see very quickly you've got this complicated web of sort of interaction that really is sort of indirect in terms of trying to make assumptions about how you can change freight patterns or freight routes or things like that. I think some of the key takeaways from that Westside Freight and Logistics study really was focused on the value of having more easy to understand information and technology for those companies, something to address basically ramp metering, the queues, the backups on ramp metering, something to deal with incidents on the freeway system, which causes a great deal of backup, and then ultimately system improvements, not everywhere, but on specific corridors that they in fact use. So I just wanted to give you kind of a round foundation as we start to talk about these questions.
Thanks, Susie. And I think one of the other takeaways from that report that was interesting to me was that I think before we looked at it, we thought that there were probably trucks leaving Washington County going to all points of the compass. They're going to Seattle, they're going to LA, they're going all over the place. And as it turns out, they are, but first they're going to the Port of Portland.
Right.
Almost every truck leaving Washington County exporting a good is going to a freight consolidation center in and around the Port of Portland first. So it really highlighted the importance of the two ways that you can get there, through the tunnel on 26 or over the hill on Cornelius Pass Road. So when you think about it, Intel's multi-billion-dollar investment in Washington County depends on two roadways for all of its product to move over. Pretty interesting.
It is, and another example of that is Columbia Sportswear. We like to say every product that they move goes through the Marine Drive interchange throughout the world.
Yeah.
So
thanks for that. So let's move on now. We've got that basic foundation to start discussing sort of this trade-off between freight movement and people movement. And let's start with the strengths of the Portland Metro's approach to balancing that and try to bring that down to Washington County if we can. And Matt, maybe I'll start with you and ask you to kind of give us your thoughts about the strengths of the system.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll sort of pivot only slightly to, as far as people movement, there's a really strong and really sort of vital link between moving people, particularly, and I should be clear, I'm going to have a little bit of a bike ped focus. There's sort of a people movement link that is direct to land use and density. Right? So we're seeing, as you look across our region, you're seeing sort of different strategies employed in close-in Portland than you see in sort of outer Washington County or further out in Clackamas County. The the strategies, but you can also see those sort of strategies play out over time. So in other words, the same strategies that we were employing in Portland in 1980 to 1990, for example, are what we're now looking to solve the bike ped transportation problems here in Washington County or in Clackamas County today in 2016. But if we were to map out sort of a density grid, we looked at sort of Portland, and you realize we've got these 200-foot blocks enclosed in Portland, or maybe 200 by 400, depending on where you are in the city of Portland. You start to realize that you've got this really sort of fine mesh of a transportation system, and you can prioritize bikes on one street, freight on another street. When you get out to Washington County, and I know this is obviously a lot of y'all, but when you move out to Washington County, you start to look at some of the same pipes that have to take all of this stuff. You have to get freight and bikes in the same facility, and I think that's where we start to see some of those the conflicts that arise. Ultimately. So I think where we've got some strengths is that we do have overall an attitude towards bike and pedestrian movement at a state level, and then down to metro and the counties and cities that does have some pretty strong language. The bike bill, obviously Oregon should be celebrated for that bit of legislation, decades old as it is, that does sort of include some really strong language about getting bike facilities in particular onto major arterials. When we get to and maybe I'll just sort of introduce the threats as well, is that maybe that's not enough as far as moving a much larger number of cyclists and pedestrians. But we do have some overarching sort of principles about, including in any transportation project, movement for bikes and pedestrians, that frankly a lot of other communities, I should be clear, I do sort of planning work all over the country, other communities are lagging far behind Oregon. So at least we have that in our quiver.
Great. Matt, I'm not sure everybody here is familiar with the bike bill requirements. Maybe you could just recap.
Sure. At the highest level, when we look at state-funded transportation projects, when you look at the highways that are in a lot of communities are actually serve as our main streets. When improvements are made to those facilities, you have to also incorporate bikes. Great on its face, let's be really sort of clear about that. Where I think the issues become is in the implementation side, that most often that defaults to a 4.5 or 5 foot bike lane on what can be a very, very busy facility. It could be a 45 or 50 mile an hour facility with a 5 foot bike lane, which I should be clear, I'm comfortable I'll ride that in the snow if you want me to, but not as comfortable for lots of other folks. So the bike bill does have that sort of written in it, that there's a certain percentage of dollars that ends up getting spent on bicycle transportation in particular. I think it's now behooves all of us to think about, well, what does it mean to get to that next level if we want to see some increased ridership, especially here in the county.
So Pam, thoughts on where the system works and where we have examples of it working for us?
Well, what I'd like to address, first of all, is going back to your SWOT analysis, the strengths. And I think the fact that we are in this room discussing this together is one of the biggest strengths. The fact that we have the WTA, and that the WTA works in concert with organizations like ours, Westside Economic Alliance, is a big piece. I mean, this is not a zero-sum game. And I think that I'm looking around at the audience here. Frank Angelo is here. Frank is the chair of our transportation committee. We have worked, for a long time with Jenny, with Ross. I'm looking also at Don Rhodes from TriMet. We've been very supportive of the business aspect of getting ridership increased in Washington County. So I do believe that together we've got a lot of strength and a lot of positive push, and that's what's really important. Whether or not you're a cyclist, you're an active transportation advocate, a transit advocate, I think that together, again, we can get this done. The one piece that I'd like to bring out is that it's difficult when we sit on the west side and get compared to the east side. And I know you talked about the density issues. It's much, many of us have been at Martin Luther King Boulevard at 5:15 at night, and you wait for more bikes than you wait for cars if you're in a car. I mean, that's, and that's wonderful. It's great, but the topography is flat, the access is good, the proximity is good, if you're living on Northeast Thompson and trying to get to Intel, it's a whole different story. You know, you're climbing mountains, you're going on roads that aren't conducive to cycling and that type of thing. So I cringe a little bit about the comparison between the West Side and the East Side. What we really need to do is focus on the West Side, focus on what we can do here to be a more friendly community. My hat's off to Washington County and to with our municipalities for the work that they've done with increasing the trail system. That's a piece that gets done out here that it's not quite as progressive in other parts. So I do think that our strengths are many. I think that we can, you know, we do work together, but my big message is this is not a zero-sum game. We shouldn't be looking at that in terms of financing. We shouldn't be looking at it in terms of what our numbers are. We should be looking at it in terms of it all floats all boats, or trucks. Because you don't want a floating truck, or last of all, we don't want a floating light rail.
Oh, you couldn't help yourself, could you, Pam?
Not a bit.
We like to say that we launched the TriMet Navy. Susie, thoughts on what are the strengths of the system?
Well, actually, I think the strengths of the system are our land use system. I mean, we actually know where prime industrial land is. We pretty much have a good sense of, you know, what the urban core looks like, and I think that's a real advantage because we can plan and predict really what kind of truck activity, what kind of freight movement requirements are going to be associated with those land uses. So I think actually Metro's 2040 growth plan to me was the best thing that was ever created. It really sort of set the stage of, you know, here's what our system, here's what our land use system looks like.
Are there any particular projects examples that you can point to, not on a policy basis, but more physical basis, where you think the balance has been struck in a creative and positive way? The one I think of, I'm not sure it worked out the way that folks had thought, but the 12th Avenue crossing in Portland, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a crossing that's very heavily used by trucks coming off I-84, particularly the Williams Bakery trucks that come through there. It's a very congested corner right near Benson High School. And the city of Portland took some lanes out in order to add bike facilities, but they also made changes to the sequencing of the lights in order to try to deal with potential backups. Did that work? Did it not work? Is that an example?
Well, I think the things that worked about it are that actually the city of Portland worked very carefully. It was Fran's Bakery with them, observed kind of what the activities were of Fran's Bakery and both pedestrian and bike crossing at that location, and tried to tweak things to try and address the issue. And I think that was fabulous because I think that's a great example of you cannot solve the problem with you know, with a sword. You need a scalpel, and you really need to focus carefully on what the need is and try to tweak it. So
what was interesting about that particular project, it's just worth sort of indicating, is on 12th Avenue we had an opportunity, or we had actually data that was much stronger than we have elsewhere in the region. In other words, we had incredible bike counts. We had pedestrian counts. We knew who the major sort of freight users were. We were able to plan for both an existing condition, and we were able to sort of project out to the future. Where I think it gets more challenging is when we're looking out sort of elsewhere in Washington. I mean, in other words, like the area we were planning in Portland is built out. It will continue to densify, but we knew where it was going. As we look out in areas in Washington County that are still developing, we actually know the freight numbers. We don't know what the bike and ped numbers would be. Right? In other words, when we're sort of planning for these projects, it becomes sort of a guesswork. And there are still parts of Portland that are this way too, especially in East Portland and Southwest, where it's anybody's guess what the percentage of bikes might be or pedestrians in the future. We're not. We struggle in those sort of planning for that kind of infrastructure, and that's where I think we tend to just focus on cars and freight. We haven't quite figured out what's that ultimate balance in 20 or 30 or 40 years maybe.
Right. Yeah. I think the other thing on that project, in addition to the good data, was the fact that the city did it kind of as a trial.
Right.
They temporarily restriped and sort of got a sense of whether it would work before they went all the way and made it permanent. So let's turn to the weaknesses. Susie, maybe start with you. What do you think where the system is falling short, where we're not striking that balance?
Well, I actually think that complete streets is not necessarily a typology that we should be gearing ourselves toward. I think it works in certain areas, but I think there are situations where you should separate modes and you should give preference to one or the other. And I think that we sort of made the decision that, you know, this is a good idea, we're going to apply it everywhere, and I just don't think that in the long run, I don't think it works, and I think it's frankly a safety issue.
Matt, I know you expressed a view on that earlier.
Yeah, I in general, I sort of completely agree, and this is where my comments about the bike bill sort of come back in. You know, the idea of sort of complete streets, or when you have a limited public resource like a street, you somehow need to make it work for everybody. You've got to get freight on it. You've got to get kids on their skateboards. You've got to get bikes and pedestrians and cars parking. You've got the whole sort of deal on a single stretch of roadway. But I think where the conflicts start to arise when you're designing for that 65-foot curb radius that Bernie mentioned earlier, and these these really long trucks. You get unintended consequences with the physical infrastructure. In other words, once you design a curb radius to accommodate a big truck, you increase the pedestrian crossing distance, for example, by 40 feet. That means you've got a mother with a stroller, or you've got an elderly person who's now crossing 40 extra feet of asphalt, depending on how the ultimate design works out, as opposed to getting across that street quickly and safely. So in general, where we can, I completely agree with Susie. If we can find those locations where you can have physical separation somehow between particularly the most vulnerable modes, bikes and pedestrians, and freight, that's where you really start to see everybody win. So that complete streets policy is sometimes misapplied.
Yeah.
So the question was about weaknesses, right? And I think that we're down.
Yeah, get right into the curb radius.
And I know what it's like to ride my bicycle next to a big truck, and it's not always comfortable. But I'd like to raise it up just a bit and say that I think that one of the weaknesses is the way we approach our funding for all transportation, the way that we talk with our legislators, the way that we work with ODOT, with all of the different groups. We need to be looking at this more comprehensively. We need to be working together. We need to not argue about where the money goes, but let's get the money first. And let's make sure that we can be creative when we look at whether or not it's time to look at bonding, whether or not it's time to look at bigger ideas to get more things done. I'm speaking as an advocacy organization, so of course I'm going to have that bent. But I do believe that we again need to work together, and the more effectively we can work together, the better off.
As George Bush said, we want to grow the pie higher.
Yeah, that's. Was he here during the marijuana time? Was that a marijuana pie?
If I could echo that for just a moment, when we combine those two thoughts of mode separation, for example, and funding, it does make us sort of think about those kinds of alliances and the kinds of projects that we advocate for funding. So, for example, it's been, and I've worked on projects like this elsewhere in the country, where we actually get freight lobbying groups actually to lobby for off-street trails, for example. That's a huge part. If you can get cyclists sort of off of onto these really sort of great trail systems, and if you've been to places like Minneapolis, Minnesota, you might know what I'm talking about. That's actually sort of part and parcel to the success of freight, right? And therefore vice versa, right? So I think you're right that we have to think not only through how we approach legislation, but how we actually think about those partnerships that are advocating for that funding in the first place.
Yep.
How do we, in more of a suburban setting, when we don't have a parallel street network, that in Portland, when Portland did their bike plan, a lot of the emphasis was on bike boulevards that were not the major freight routes, so that you could get the bikes in a separated right-of-way, basically. How do you, what mechanisms could you use out in a suburban setting that kind of give you that same feel where you don't have the parallel roads?
It's a great question, and this is where I think the...
That's why I asked you.
Yeah, no, I'm buying time, obviously. This is where, this is where I get to, I'll try to just dream big for just a moment, and that I think that there are, that in the near term, we can probably do more things like cycle tracks, and if you're not familiar with a cycle track, it's a grade separated facility, but it's on the same roadway. It's either grade separated or physically separated. It's not just paint for a bike lane, but it's got either bollards or it's got a sort of raised curve. You might see some in Bend, for example. So you've got some near-term sort of ideas on how to just create a little bit more of a safe facility. But in the bigger scheme, this is where we're really we need to start looking a little bit more aggressively at some of these off-street facilities, the kinds of things that Portland has a really tough time doing because there just aren't those kinds of opportunities. We do need to look for that. I know I told you all this in our when we met last week, but I'll mention to you, like, as a bike pet advocate, I kind of look forward to the next recession. And here's why. And it's going to sound terrible, but right now in East Portland, in parts of Southwest Portland, and then throughout Clackamas and Washington counties, we have a lot of cul-de-sacs. We have a lot of streets that don't sort of match up. It's the kind of thing that we should be socking some money away for, such that when the next recession hits and some houses can be had for pennies on the dollar, and I'm sorry if that's your house, I'll apologize in advance, we should be buying those out and punching streets through. Right? In other words, we have to start to find some ways to get ourselves out of a 1950s transportation system model that is ultimately not going to serve us. Right? So I think we've got to look at some of those really sort of aggressive where can we punch trails through and where can we actually start connecting roadways so that we can start designing particularly a bike ped and even a transit system that can be sort of separated from a freight system and then therefore get everybody to work efficiently.
I just want to go on record to say I'm not looking forward to the next recession. It's my job to be working toward avoiding the next recession. But at the same time, I don't think that we can. We should stop looking at opportunities just because we're healthy.
Oh,
We should be looking at healthy opportunities. We should be talking with our businesses. Our businesses get this. They know. I mean, you go out. Intel has a bike sharing program. Nike, you go to Murray Boulevard and there's orange and yellow bikes all over the place from the Nike employees. That's great. But we should be honoring that. We should be pushing it. We should be looking at the parking that's on your table right now. How do we make it more convenient for everybody, which in turn helps get less cars on the road. But at the same time, I don't think we can forget that what runs our state is a healthy economy. There's no question about it. We have to be able to move freight. We have to be able to support our businesses in what they do. And I think that's a very strong message that we need to make sure we get across.
Pam, you actually just sort of hit on one of those sort of great untapped resources, which are these sort of large employers and particularly large technology firms. I get to do a lot of work in Silicon Valley right now with a fairly large tech company down there that has incredible sort of amounts of data and has actually figured out a lot of stuff. I can't tell you that I'm working for Google, but but I'll tell you this company that I work with has the largest private shuttle fleet in America, and probably in North America. They also have the largest yellow bike, free bike sort of program. There's companies who have, in their own interest, have figured some of this stuff out. The problem is they're not telling TriMet how to do it, right? They haven't sort of shared those results yet. In other words, I think we've got, in Intel and Nike and others that are here, we have an opportunity to partner and to sort of crack some of those codes a bit and to sort of share that information not only with other employers, but also public agencies in a way that will actually meet their interests. In other words, it's in Nike's interest to not have the streets sort of all clogged up. It's in Columbia's interest to not have the streets all clogged up. If we can just get them to realize that solving another company's transportation problems is in their interest, that's where we can unlock a lot of potential.
Yeah, I want to build on that. I think FedEx is a great example of a company that is trying to do the same thing, which is thinking creatively about how they solve the problem. They've got long haul issues, air freight issues, but they also do all the pickup and delivery. And so they've done a lot of things. needs as well. And partially, I think we need to be able to tap into them. And I think technology, having streets that are communicating with actually the trucking companies is a great opportunity that we haven't even dealt with yet. So I think there are, from a technological standpoint, a lot of things that are out there that are promising, frankly.
So I want to leave time for Q&A, so we're getting pretty close.
We got about 15,
Okay.
20 minutes.
So just any other opportunities? What about congestion pricing or information technologies, low-profile curbs? What do you see out there that we should be thinking about as the next thing that we want to grab onto?
I'd like to jump in here for a minute, and this is going to sound a little bit like a commercial, but most of you in this room are members already. But I would really encourage you to talk to Frank, talk to Don Ottermott, talk to people in the room that come on a regular basis, Tom Mills, to our transportation committee meetings. Because at those meetings, what we do is talk a lot. Susie was there presenting last week. We talk a lot about the new technologies, the things that are coming up, and the ways that we can share that information. And we have a good mix in the room of public and private, and it really does help, get those words out. I mean, Don and the ITS programs that he's been working on for years, that the understanding how they work, understanding what it means. We have bike presentations. We have presentations from Jenny and this group. But it's a good place to come and share information. Andrew comes and talks about the future study, and it's so important to share the information so that we can get to those nuances. And you're talking about the search engine business that you might work for. I'd love to have you come out and talk to the Transportation Committee about what they're doing down there. So again, it's that concept of working together to solve the problems.
I was just going to say, as far as tolling, I think tolling makes perfect sense. I come from the East Coast. I also believe in sales taxes, but let's see which of those we're going to see in Oregon first.
You're not running for office.
Obviously not. So, I think that's a huge opportunity. I'm not a big fan of freight-only lanes. I'm not sure that they are practical unless you've got a very, very heavy corridor of trucks only. And just for y'all's perspective, trucks really represent about between 5 and 8% of the total traffic stream, unless you're on something like Columbia Boulevard or Marine Drive, where they tend to be up in the 20%. So it's hard to have a freight-only lane, although I'm not opposed to looking at it. I just think that there are things that we should maybe test out before we implement.
Any thoughts on
Sure. Well, I mentioned one, since it's in the news sort of a lot these days. From a policy perspective, when you start talking about self-driving cars, which I know sound like they're space age, but getting to be in Silicon Valley and actually sort of see them sort of driving around, there's always these usually these 20-something engineers who are sort of sitting in them with their hands at their side, like they look terrified because there's nothing to hold on to. But these things they're coming. I mean, there are several companies that are making really big bets on these things, really big investments, and they're working with legislators now to start getting these things approved. It'll be interesting to see what that means for our transportation system. I mean, the efficiencies can be incredible, not just from a roadway perspective, but also how they park. Right? Once you build a parking structure, for example, for self-driving cars, you don't need all the elevator cores and the stairways and things because the cars are kind of driving in and parking themselves. So there's a whole. This will be in our lifetimes and our kids' lifetimes that these things, if it also pans out, that's going to be something. What does that mean for freight? What does it mean to then have maybe there is a freight-only lane at that point because you can, self-driving trucks. Now you're really scaring me. But I think but all this is sort of coming. But what does that mean from a policy perspective? Are we putting the right sort of things in place, and do we understand what that's going to mean from an infrastructure standpoint? And a policy standpoint, and we're sort of queuing ourselves up because it won't just be the city of Portland that can pass that. It's going to need to be sort of a regional kind of look at those things. So that's something I would say to keep an eye on because they are, like when you drive around Silicon Valley now or take a bus around Silicon Valley, they're all over the place now and it's getting really interesting.
Yeah. I like to point out that self-driving cars really only work when all the cars are self-driving cars. Because once you get all self-driving cars out, if you have one guy who's like, I'm going to game the system, I'm going to drive in and out between these cars, then the whole system crashes. So
Yeah, it gets interesting.
I have a suspicion that when we put that out there, that there's going to be a few people who say, you will pry the wheel from my cold, dead hands. So let's shift now to WTA, and what should the WTA be thinking about working on, advocating for, to try to build this system that balances and integrates both freight and people movement. Pam, thoughts on that?
I thought we were going to go to questions.
Soon.
I would say that continuing the collaborative work, continuing working together, continuing the concept of, okay, we need to come together to get more money into the system, we need to come together to get more opportunities available to all of us, whether it's last mile, whether it's transit opportunities, whatever it might be. It's important to continue doing that. And to not shut down about the side that you may represent, and to be open and listening to both sides.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, WTA represents the businesses, right? You're solving both the product movement side as well as the people movement side. So talk to the businesses, find out what they can do, what their challenges are, and use that and continue to have conversations like this, frankly.
Well, I'll pivot back to my sort of opening comments. I think that there's just this equal component about land use, and really sort of watching land use policy and seeing sort of where where some of the different municipalities within the county are going, because I think that getting a certain level of density will sort of help in terms of not only sort of where housing is, but also where where employment is, and making sure that bikeability, walkability, transit serviceability are all sort of interplaying, and that's where I'd sort of put it.
Great. All right, Pam. Just my personal view is Pam mentioned the magic word money. So I think it's easier to do more with money. So that would be one thing to think about. We have a legislative session coming up in 2017 when we hope the legislature will look at raising gas tax or vehicle registration fee for transportation programs, and it's a lot easier to build bike paths and bike facilities when you have money to do it. So let's go to questions. Questions from the audience. Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Don.
I'll be brave on the first question. I guess when I think about economics and the velocity of money and economic growth, I'm curious about freight movement within the region rather than something is a widget's built here and it goes to the port and leaves. Something that's built here goes over here, gets recombobulated, sent over here,
Right.
gets something done to it again, then maybe it goes to Boeing and gets put on a plane. So is there a lot of economic development and added growth within Washington County with that kind of freight movement between companies?
Yes, I mean, absolutely, and Intel is a great example. A lot of their suppliers are located here, and their product moves from one point to another point in their supply chain. I mean, that's the whole concept of basically traded sector businesses and the concept of like businesses trying to locate together. I think one of the challenges that we have with Washington County is that, I think Matt described it very well, is the network is not a grid network, and then a lot of the movement outside of Washington County to go north-south or international is through basically two corridors. And so I guess I'm more than answering your question, but the short answer is yes.
So you might have something that's done at, say, at Lamb Research in 12, and that's then brought up to Hillsborough, and it's not coming up in an 18-wheeler kind of classic, what we think of as giant freight semi truck.
Right.
but in a smaller truck, or maybe even it's in a van.
Could be,
Is that-
potentially, right,
You can
yes.
have that kind of freight.
Yeah, and unfortunately, as much, I mean, we do count truck, not we, the port, but local jurisdictions, ODOT counts trucks, but we are not as skilled at counting types of trucks. So oftentimes what we end up counting are the 18-wheelers. We don't always get the smaller vans, the small SEVAs, or the FedExes, or even the delivery vans. So we miss that part of the economic activity, and maybe not treating it as we should, potentially, giving it the economic value.
That's one of those great potential partnering opportunities with some of these high-tech firms, right? As far as companies who deal with big data.
Right.
That seems like a pretty interesting data set to have.
To get to Don's question too, just 3 weeks ago, we had an event at Dyke Machine, and it's Andy Dyke's company. He's the chair of Washington County, and he does a lot of supply work for Intel. So it was interesting to listen to what his logistical issues are in getting things to Intel. Certainly he's out in that area. It's probably not the same thing in terms of long distances traveled. But if you look at the number of jobs that are created in the supply chain for Intel, I think it's for every one job at Intel, it's 3 jobs in the larger community. They're not just people working there by themselves. They're doing something, and it's most likely going back to the mothership, if you will. So there is quite a bit of that travel that occurs within the community at large. And the Millsboro Economic Development people will be able to tell you how many of those businesses are related back to Intel. Same thing goes for Lam Research. They have their own supply chain. Any group that has that, and it is hard to count, but it creates congestion issues perhaps, but it also keeps our economy here and keeps it strong. And that's the other thing I think we need to remember.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that because you're adding value to the region, you're really protecting, like you were saying, 1 job into 3, 4 into 5 jobs, because all that production is here.
Right.
Right.
Although, as Intel will always point out, 98% of their customer base is outside of the United States.
That's
right. So eventually you have to move the product.
End use customer, not necessarily.
Not a local.
Yeah.
Questions? Yeah.
I'll go out on that. So,
And maybe just say who you are.
I'm Mike Weston. I'm with King City. So you have competing interests for the monetary value and the infrastructure packages that are produced by the government for, say, port infrastructure, highway infrastructure, intermodal infrastructure. Where do you see your biggest ROI? You know, like if you look at Washington County or Portland in general, is it the port infrastructure that gives you your biggest ROI? Is it the highway infrastructure that's going to give you your biggest? Where are we going to get the biggest bang for our buck?
It's definitely the port infrastructure.
I think it's nonprofits.
Well, I mean, I do think that it has to do, and it's just fact of the matter is that the road network carries the largest volume of economic activity, whether it's individuals moving themselves to work or it's the products. So I do think it is investment in the road network. Now, I'm not advocating that we expand everything, but I do think you have to pay very close attention to that, because in a smaller market like Oregon, if our road system isn't performing, we really impede the businesses' growth here, because they have to do what they do in order to survive. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really there's another sort of twist on your question, which sort of separates it out into sort of a couple different fields. You can sort of directly tie investment in a roadway infrastructure to the movement of goods and services, for example. And that's pretty easy. It gets a little fuzzier when you start talking about like worker productivity. In other words, like how much time do you waste commuting? And again, we're like, I know people might complain about the traffic here. Like try getting from San Francisco down to San Jose at 8 o'clock in the morning any day of the week, or Washington D.C. or Atlanta, Georgia. But there's a whole sort of worker productivity sort of question that you can ask. When you start to get into that realm, that's where I sort of start to come in at it. Because when you start to look at, well, where's the biggest return on investment? If you've got that right sort of land use and you've got commutes that are not 20 miles, but they're more in that 4 to 7 mile range or 2 to 7 mile range, then the return on investment becomes much clearer that if you're investing in bike and ped infrastructure, particularly bike infrastructure, your return on investment is humongous. Right? Portland, up until about 2005, Portland's entire bike infrastructure had been built for the cost of 1 mile of urban freeway. Right? So that's, I mean, it's just a huge sort of infrastructure piece. Transit has sort of a similar sort of return. I mean, the capital cost on transit is, obviously substantial, especially when you're building light rail bridges and things. Thanks for that, by the way. Appreciate it. But you start to get sort of returns. But you only get that if you have that right land use mix, because once people have to commute outside of a bike range, that's where, and maybe e-bikes are going to sort of play a role here, and maybe we'll see that trend as well. But that's where that return on investment starts to become sort of a different calculation, because suddenly that's when you really are looking at transit, and you're looking at higher speed transit and other things. So it's you have to kind of take your question and kind of parse it out into different, like, what are you really trying to test out?
And I think there's the answer is kind of, it depends, because if you have a choke point on a major highway, that's impacting freight. But if you fix that and you don't have the final connection between the intermodal facility and the rail yard and so forth, then that becomes the critical link.
Once again, this is not a zero-sum game.
Right.
I really want to push that again, because it's easy to get into a conversation about, either or. Should we put money over here or over here? We need to put money together into all aspects, because we need to get people to work, we need to get freight to market, we need to have an entire complete system that works. So while I appreciate your question, it starts leading us down this pathway, and I think that that's one of the mistakes that we have the potential to make.
And maybe talk about Connect Oregon and how that has been a mechanism for trying to bring those things together.
Yeah, if you all are not familiar with Connect Oregon, it's a lottery-backed bond program that funds non-roadway, both freight and transit, and freight and people movement projects. So it includes transit, bike ped, but also rail, air, and marine-related projects. And it's really driven by an economic criteria. So, and that's been pretty successful, and it's been great statewide because there are a number of projects that have been able to benefit local communities outside of the Portland region that really can rely on that.
And politically, it's a great opportunity, because the bike head folks come together with the freight folks, because they're both getting benefit from that program.
Right.
Are we pretty much last question then? Final question. Make it a tough one.
Tom.
Okay, Tom. Really hard question.
This is going to be directed right at Bernie.
How has the departure of the container shipping companies exacerbated?
Okay, look at Tom. Gotta go.
Tom.
And what can we do to solve that? Really hard.
Let's ask. I can answer the first question easier, actually. So we did lose the last carrier, as you all maybe have read, for our container terminal. And I will tell you, this has been devastating for the state as a whole, a lot of the businesses, because they really do realize that there's an economic value to moving their product through Terminal 6 as opposed to having to dray it up to Seattle-Tacoma. And the cost has been pretty significant. So it's a challenge. It is one that the governor is paying very close attention to and trying to help solve. It's an issue between the operator and the labor union. And the labor union, as I was explaining to Bernie, is largely driven by the West Coast compact, basically. And so it's not just the union here, it's the union up and down the West Coast. And so it makes it particularly challenging to deal with this issue. all I can say is we are doing everything we possibly can to try and solve it, and but we're not going to solve it. It's not going to be solved in the next year. That's just the reality. How's that?
All right, well, Tom Arnold, Susie Lahsene, Pam Treece, thank you very much. Let's give our panel.
Thank you so much. I did want to take care of a few business matters before we break. And I do see a few skewers of chicken and beef in the back, so we'll want you to go ahead and take care of those for us before you go. But I would like to ask Mr. Steve Silver to come to the front, please. Let's go. Come on. Yeah. So Steve has served on the board for the last 5 years, all 5 years as treasurer, and he has decided that he is sick to death of the rest of us. He is going to move on and do something a little bit different. So we didn't want to depart today without acknowledging his service to our board and telling him how much we very much appreciate him, as well as his very irreverent treasury reports every month. And so we have for you this. And this is of course, WTA branded cutting board.
Very nice.
And along with that, we have a few goodies for you to enjoy. And I was meant to point out that it does do double duty here. This was more for University of Tennessee, which is his very alma mater, very close to his heart. But also WTA, that is our color. So
thank you so much.
This is for
That's
you,
very
sir.
nice.
Thank you very much. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge another departure that hits me right here, and that is Ms. Jenny Cadigan. Please come on down. So Jenny has been, I feel very short. Thank you. Jenny has been with WTA, I think 3 years, 3+, and the last 2 she has been here as our executive director. She is the only one I've served under, and therefore I can say wholeheartedly she's brilliant, and she's my favorite executive director I've worked under, so that's fantastic. But we did want to note that she has taken a new opportunity at Oregon Health Sciences University, and we're thrilled for her. It's going to be a great position, and she gets to ride the tram to work every day. She told me that and I almost hung up on her today. I'm like, are you kidding? You get to ride your bike across the brand new bridge and then take the tram. But I love her enough that I got her this gift on behalf of the board, and so I will share this with you now. Jenny is a little adventurer. She loves to do a lot of fun things, and we hope this little kit gets you started. So there's a bunch of little things, plus a little gift card to REI, because who doesn't love REI that lives in Oregon? So we would like you to have this, and we celebrate your new position, and we will miss you. Thank you. This organization. I'm proud to be a part of it. I know the rest of the board is very, very much going to miss her and the spirit she brings to this organization and the things that she has led us through over the last couple of years. And so, thank you again. I do want to let you know that we're not without a captain at the helm here, and so we have an interim executive director that's going to be stepping in for us, and I'd like to introduce you to her now. Tracy, please stand. This is Tracy Love Silver. Tracy has a wealth of experience, now to include taking videos of our speeches and panel discussions. But Tracy stepped in for us when there was a transition between Heather McCary and Jenny, and so she did a few months for us as an executive director, as an interim, and so we asked her if she'd be interested again. She's going to do that, and she's going to help us on our search for our next executive director. So she will keep the train on the tracks, or the boat going in the right direction. I'm using a lot of, similarities here. Anyway, so we're thrilled to have Tracy. She's going to help us through this transition. And I did want to, again, thank everyone for coming. If you check your little name tag, there might be a little red ticket in the back. If you haven't used it, either take advantage of the drinks in the back or have this little pocket right here, and you can just put it in right there. But do take advantage of any food that's left over. Mix and mingle for a little bit. We're so glad to see your faces here, and we'll see you next year. Thanks again.